Hi, Angela Wolf here, owner of Angela Wolf Patterns and Online Academy. And you're still in my studio, so welcome. Because of the travel restrictions, we're on remote. So today, we're going to be working on the Bella, and we're going to insert the mesh sleeve and sew the elastic casing. So let's get started. So here I have the fabric that we did on that first episode. It's all embroidered. A couple things that I do before I even sew this in. Go to the wrong side of your fabric. Boy, this looks so good you can hardly tell which one's the wrong side. And you're going to press up this bottom hem. Give it a little steam. I'm pressing up about 1/2 of an inch. We're going to create the casing for our elastic. And then fold it up one more time. Now you just, depending on what size elastic you're using, you want to make sure there's plenty of room for that elastic to fit in there, because we're not going to be stitching on the elastic. It's just going to be a casing. Pressing. Use your clapper to make sure it's a nice crease. If you do this before you sew the sleeve together, it's so much easier, which you'll see. All right, so that's ready. Now you're going to pin your sleeve to the arm's eye of your shirt, which I've already have finished here for you. I didn't really think you needed to watch me pinning. So what I've done is I've pinned this sleeve, but what I want you to take a look at, remember when I left that little extra around the fabric when I was cutting it out? This is why. When I sew, I'm going to have the sleeve side down. And if I have this mesh sticking out just a little bit, then I know that I'm not going to miss any spots and there won't be any holes in my sleeve. So we're going to go to the sewing machine with that. And one last thing, take your elastic and just wrap it around your wrist, however tight you want that to be. I usually leave maybe 2 fingers in here because you don't want it too tight on your wrist, and it also depends how thick your knit is. And make sure you mark that because we're going to stitch that as well. All right, I'll meet you at the sewing machine. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is insert our sleeve. And it's much easier to do this before you sew together the side seams and everything. So I'm going to use a straight stitch with a stitch length of 2.5. And the mesh can get very tricky to sew, so make sure that it's laying nice and flat. And again, you can just barely see that fabric sticking out on the edge. And I will know that I'm capturing all of the mesh as I stitch around the arm's eye. You know I don't like to use pins very often, but when it comes to inserting mesh or silk chiffon into a sleeve, pins are almost a must in order to be able to hold all this fabric in place. I guess you'd say the mesh kind of has a mind of its own. All right, getting around to the back side. Keep my hands out of the way here. And I'm using a contrasting thread, again, so you can see this. Okay, let's see what we have. So we've inserted the sleeve. Now, you don't want this seam allowance sticking out. That kind of doesn't, it just doesn't look good. So depending on your fabric, mine knit does not fray. So if yours does, then you'll want to run this through a serger. But since mine does not fray, my next step, if your fabric is really unruly, you can press the seam allowance towards the garment side. But mine's fine, so I'm just going to finger press my seam allowance towards the garment and run a row of top stitching. So this is where, depending on how fitted your top is, you might want to use a triple stitch. I'm just going to use a straight stitch, but this time I'm changing the stitch length to a 3.0. So as I sew, I'll just stop every couple of inches to make sure that that seam allowance is facing towards the garment. This is a secure way of not having your seam allowance pop out and show through your mesh. This is the same technique, by the way. In a next episode, we'll be sewing the Bella with silk sleeves, silk chiffon, and this is the exact same thing you'll be doing there. All right, so this is what we have, and you can see the top stitching on here, and now you won't be able to see that seam allowance. See how nice that looks? All right, so what about sewing in the elastic? So I just have a small sample here. I thought it would be much easier for you to see than that big old top. So here is my elastic. Wherever you had that marked, you're going to want to slide this under, and you're going to put a zigzag stitch on here. So use a zigzag stitch and start with your needle right in the center of that elastic. Just go forward and back a few times. And I usually like to do this twice just to secure the elastic. Not that you're gonna be out playing sports in this or anything, but it'll hold it so it won't open. All right, and any extra that you have here, go ahead and just cut off. There you go. Okay, so we already have our pressed up hem that we did first. So slide your elastic in here. And you're going to insert your elastic while you sew this seam. So I'm just going to put a couple pins just to hold this in place. You have to be very careful not to stitch over the elastic though. You're going to change back to a straight stitch, and I'm going to use a stitch length of 3.0. You could also use a zigzag stitch if you want, if your fabric's really stretchy, but a straight stitch should be fine. So what you're going to do, and it's a little tricky, so I'm going to try to keep my hands out of the way so you can see this. You're going to stitch on the edge of your fold, encasing the elastic, but not stitching through the elastic. So see how I maneuver this out of the way, and I'm stitching just on that folded edge. You can definitely see this bright pink thread on here. And once you get to a certain point, you won't be able to move that elastic, so you'll have to lift up your presser foot. So my needle's in the down position, and I'm just going to slide this, and let's kind of ease some of this elastic back through. All right. I'm just going to stop this stitch because I think you'll see this better if I just pull this out for a second. So what I'm doing, so here's my folded edge, and then I just keep sliding the elastic further out like this. All right, so now my stitch, where I'm stitching, I have flat elastic, so it's all gathered right here right now. So I'll go back under there and finish this. Now when you're sewing this, you would not need to pull that fabric out. I just wanted you to see what was going on. Now depending on what size you're sewing, if your wrist is really tiny, this part can get a little tricky, so just keep stopping and maneuvering the elastic. You've probably seen me do this a few different ways where I've enclosed the elastic right into the seam before. That's a way too, but this just makes a nice casing, and as you'll see on the sleeve, it's really pretty. All right, and we're on to the last little bit here. You can see how that pressed crease really makes a difference, because you can just go ahead and stitch. You know exactly where you're going. It's going to be even all the way around. If you were to try to take this mesh and stitch without pressing that up, I'm not so sure it would look that good. All right, let's see what we have here. So there's my pressed up edge. This is the inside of the sleeve, and the elastic is free all the way around. So when you put this on, which I made this a little bigger just so you could see, let's go back and look at the real sleeve. So as you can see, the elastic is encased in that hem that we had, and the pressing that up really made that easy. Now this is pretty large. Your elastic would be tighter. So for example, here's a top that I have finished, which is velvet. And once you have that casing, you can see this wraps tightly on your wrist, and then the fabric just bells right over it. Very flowy. Thus the name of the sleeve, the Bella. So again, that's how simple it is to insert mesh, secure your seam allowance, add the elastic casing, and in the next lesson, we're going to be taking the sleeves and adding silk chiffon. See you then.